Hello everyone, I hope everyone's doing very well. Today's video is something slightly different. I'm going to be reviewing specifically non-fiction books. And here I have 5 non-fiction books that I read this year. Actually, I think I've read all of these in the last couple months and they just really kind of stuck with me. Like, reading non-fiction is just so important to broaden your horizons and your perspectives, and I really encourage everyone to pick up an interesting non-fiction book, because recently it feels like I've been reading more non-fiction than fiction. Not even philosophy. I don't know if philosophy counts as non-fiction. I think it's its like own kind of section, but yeah, these are just straight up non-fiction books. They're kind of all a blend of history and politics. So let's just begin. The first one is one of the first books I read this year. I believe I read this in February or so, and it is called Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution by Suzy Kim. And Suzy Kim is basically just the leading scholar on North Korea, and she's basically this is a detail of the few years before the Korean War, essentially, and it details the organisation of society, the democratic process. It briefly touches on the role of women, and it also goes very extensively through the literacy programs. I found this such an interesting and eye-opening book. It is such a good history, and it kind of tracks the history of everyday people. It follows the land reforms, education and things like that, and yeah, it was just really well written, well researched, well sourced, and generally just extremely interesting. So this is the first one that I would recommend. The second one, I read this I think 3 weeks ago or maybe 4 weeks ago, and this book is called Poverty and Neoliberalism, Persistence and Reproduction in the Global South by Ray Bush. And this book, I found this very interesting because recently I've been taking an interest in Africa and this global like exploitation that we're seeing right now, and I've been trying to learn more about that and how imperialist countries basically have these neo-colonial policies or colonial policies over developing countries, which essentially stops their development. I'm actually also listening to an audiobook at the moment called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and the guy who is, I think his name is Walter something, he's quite famous but I've forgotten his name, and he says that we should use the word underdeveloped rather than developing, because in many cases the development rate is actually going backwards, and developing implies that they're like catching up to some kind of framework, but that's actually not true. I'll say underdeveloped. Anyway, this book is essentially about policies and programs which essentially keep underdeveloped countries in debt traps, as well as dividing the land, taking land and resources away from the local people and the local markets. And essentially the main argument of this book is, well, first of all, it's against neoliberalism, and it's against this idea of, he calls it the neoclassical bias. And this is essentially the assumption that all countries have equal access to the market once they're involved in market trade. So it's the assumption that once, say, Sudan is incorporated in the global market, then all of the citizens of Sudan will have equal access to this market. But that's actually not true, and so he's kind of arguing against this neoliberal perspective that we place on underdeveloped countries, which states that, oh, as long as they're like incorporated into the world market, then they'll gain more capital and things like that. But that's actually not true, and their incorporation in the global market is in fact what hinders their development. So it's an extremely interesting book. He talks about a few different case studies of different countries, specifically Zimbabwe and Sudan, and I think he touches on Nigeria as well. And I just found it incredibly interesting and I really recommend it. The next book is pretty famous. It's The Question of Palestine by Edward Said. So essentially this just details a overall history of Zionism. It's more about the foundations of Zionist ideology than the ways that it infringes on the lives of Palestinian people. But he does kind of give a timeline on the Israeli settlement as well. And Edward Said he is a Palestinian academic, and he basically also advocates for the importance of the Palestinian people in creating their own narratives and resisting the imperialist narratives. I really, really recommend this book. It does go into a lot of detail about specific Zionist writers, like the original Zionist writers, and it shows very clearly that the link between Zionism, Orientalism, and generally racist and colonialist ideologies. I actually need to read a lot more about Palestine. I've got a couple more books on my TBR, but overall this was super good. I think this was written a while ago though. Yeah, in 1979, so I'm kind of looking for a more up-to-date political book. So I was debating which Dworkin book to put in this video because I've been reading lots of Dworkin this year. I think I've read 5 books by Dworkin this year, but I'm going to talk about the most recent one I read because a lot of her ideas in this also intersect with the other ones that I read, and I found this maybe one of her best. Is kind of about the pervasive nature of women's oppression and how it essentially like invades every side of the political spectrum. So it's kind of not really a justification but almost an explanation for right-wing women's ideas and perspectives. So, you know, taking the very obvious recent example in America with the anti-abortion laws, etc., etc., a lot of people have a lot of anger against Republican women and women who are for traditional family values. We've also seen a resurgence in kind of trad wife culture in a way. You know, these figures that we have like Nora Smith, Ballerina Farm. So yeah, I think this book is like super relevant to today's political environment. So essentially it's about this myth that women who follow traditional values, they have a husband and they just have their role as a housewife. This is kind of a defense mechanism against the oppressive society that we live in. For example, sexual violence. It's this idea that having a husband will somehow protect you from sexual violence. Dworkin is very against marriage as an institute because of women just historically and continuously being abused by their husbands and sexual violence committed to them by their husbands. But there's this idea that if you have a husband, then it will only be committed to you by one person. Idea of self-defense against an innately hostile society, and the only thing that to do is like a reach for traditional values. Her exploration of the specifically systematic oppression that women face in the United States in, I think it's the penultimate chapter, called The Coming Genocide, and I found that so interesting because usually a lot of her books are so heavily theoretical and they don't involve a large amount of research, but this specific chapter was quite research oriented, and I think she proved her point really well, which is essentially about the systematic oppression of women through state-funded nursing homes, welfare systems designed to keep women in poverty. She also goes into the way that anti-abortion laws disproportionately affect Black women and poorer women in America, and the way that this is kind of a population control program almost. The people who die from illegal abortions, the women who die from illegal abortions, are overwhelmingly women of colour and poor women. And she even talks about state programs for hysterectomies. I also found her chapter on anti-feminism, which is the very last chapter, very enlightening and amazing. I especially think that her point about this idea that women are separate but equal to men is inherently oppressive. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. Along with the resurgence of the trad wife figure, we have these people defending it, saying, oh, women can have different roles, feminine, you know, Wizard Liz type of content, your inner feminine side, masculine side, whatever. I think that it's definitely kind of appears as feminist, but in reality Dworkin talks about how it's the assumption that women have inherently different natures to men is the same assumption that feeds racial superiority, etc., etc., and it is inherently oppressive in its nature. So the last book I'm going to talk about, I actually read this like last week, but I low-key haven't stopped thinking about it, and when I first started reading it, I didn't think I'd like it. I wasn't even sure if I was going to finish it, but by the end I found it so good, and I loved the essays about exploitation of women in the global south and the intersection between global capitalism and women's oppression. So Silvia Federici is a Marxist feminist scholar, and this book essentially touches on many things. It's a collection of essays. The first part is about her argument for why housework should be paid, and the fact that housework and reproductive labour, which is essentially anything that contributes to the reproduction of the human species, so that could be cooking, rearing children, etc., etc., why that is so essential to the capitalist system, that is wageless. And effectively she also talks about this false separation of your sexual side and your like professional side. So this is when this is like the idea of going home at night and unwinding, and the idea of a Saturday night being like the absolute binary opposite of a Monday morning, and this idea of like separation of the selves. And she really explores how this is intrinsic to the continuation of the capitalist system, is this way that a worker almost feels alienated from his self at work, and so he doesn't see that all of these things he does at home, everything that, you know, the housewife does to keep the worker like almost running, aren't recognized as labor, but essentially they are like of paramount importance to continuing the labor that this person does, and so they should be recognized as essential to the continuation of society. So as I mentioned, my favorite chapter of this was her chapter on the reproduction of labor power in the global economy, which was essentially about the way that women are continuously exploited in the global south. And she specifically also talks about communal landowning and subsistence farming, and the way that women kind of try and use these methods, which are anti-capitalist, to kind of gain some small power in their lives, and how they keep these families and these people going all over the world with their subsistence farming and their labor, and that obviously falls disproportionately on women. She also talks about things like the garment industry. The exploitation in factories often is also directly affecting women. So yeah, generally I just found it a really good read. I also found that the ideas in this book did intersect with the ideas in Poverty and Neoliberalism, which I also really liked, drawing connections between books. Those are 5 non-fiction books that I really enjoyed this year. I'm so excited to read more non-fiction this year. I love reading non-fiction recently, as I said in the introduction, and I will likely make like another non-fiction video at the end of the year, maybe with things that I've read since then. But I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope I've inspired you to go and buy a non-fiction book and learn something about something you're interested in, and challenge perspectives and stereotypes and everything good like that. So I hope you guys have a good week, and I'll see you in my next video.